Maybe people can't grasp the fact that the economy is not always fully employed. Although they see it with their own eyes, they see actually, and lots of households must experience it personally, that, you know, unemployment is rising and that people are spending less and that shops are closing and that businesses are closing and that mortgages are foreclosing. All these things are very visible, and yet all they can see, all they get are these prudent messages. Save more, you know, tighten your belt, government must cut its deficits, as though somehow there's no unemployment. Well, that's really, I think, what needs to be got across. And I know it's difficult. Keynes, you know, did try and get that across. And I'd like a political leader to actually give people a simple economics lesson. No technicality, no maths, just simple common sense. And then I think you might have an effect. Sorry, but I saw your hand go up.
I'm an emotionless economist, so I cannot choose which question to ask you. But if I could, it would probably be irrelevant anyway. But let me try this one. Let me say, downplayed the possibility of a debt explosion in the U.S. economy. But your definition of a debt explosion, as I heard you present it, was a tax increase. David Brooks suggested earlier that one of the problems with our society right now is that it is not acceptable to discuss sacrifice, tax increases being a form of sacrifice. I do not recall in Keynes any recognition of the possibility that the irrationality of behavior, the inability to foresee the future would suggest that kind of a policy error. But it seems that right now that is a serious risk in this society, in this economy, which could possibly throw us over the brink of the kind of debt problem that I think you were speaking of as a fairly low probability. I just wonder about your reaction to the possibility that we would be unwilling to take the necessary steps to prevent that.
Well, some of the steps, as I suggested, to keep down the debt and indeed to reduce it, arise quite naturally from the recovery of the economy. Just think of this: the national debt in the United States is projected to be about 100%, maybe a bit more, of GDP. Certainly, I'm thinking of the English projections. Both societies ended the Second World War with a national debt of 250% or more of GDP. Within 10 or 15 years, it was down to about 50. And these were not years of particularly high inflation either. It was basically that the economies grew quite rapidly and shrunk the national debt proportionately. Now, it's true that sacrifice is called for. People are making sacrifices in their household, in households are, by reducing their spending and therefore reducing their indebtedness, which, as I suggest, and you said, one way of putting it is that simply public indebtedness is replacing private indebtedness. Well, up to a point that's true and necessary. In this period. But there will, if taxes have to go up somewhat in order to pay for some of it, then they have to go up. And people shouldn't be prepared to say that. The idea that taxes should never go up is a very, very late, rather recent idea that they should always go down. And this relates to something I said earlier, which is the way Keynesianism became acceptable to conservatives for a number of years was that it was associated purely with tax cutting. But of course, Keynesian policy required raising taxes when necessary as well. And the idea that taxes, you see, the Republican agenda was to get the government down, get it smaller. That was the long-run agenda. So what you do is you cut taxes, and then you get a deficit. Now, this cutting taxes might be stimulatory to some extent, and they believe that would be true. But you also have to cut spending. So you cut taxes, you cut spending, you cut taxes, you cut spending, and finally, except for military spending, government spends nothing. Now, that is a political argument. It's not based in economics. It's a political argument. It's an ideological argument against big government. It's as simple as that. And I think you raised perfectly correct set of questions, but I think that they can be answered, and I don't think Keynes was ever in favor of continual deficits and increases in the national debt. Sorry, yeah, and
Sir, is massive investment in public infrastructure does not that logically flow from your position in terms of government's short-term response?
Yeah, I think if in fact banks are not, if long-term rates are not coming down sufficiently to sort of create a stimulus to private investment, then government has to do it. Keynes said, look, it doesn't really matter what it does. I mean, that was maybe slightly tongue-in-cheek, filling up holes with treasury notes and getting people to dig them up again, and helicopter money, as Milton Friedman talked about it. But he would have much preferred using government spending to create new assets. Public infrastructure, exactly. And the trouble has always been said that it takes a long time. It takes a long time for these things to get going, and then the recession will be over, and we won't need them. Well, we need them whatever the case, because American infrastructure is not one of the greatest in the world, even though perhaps you believe it is. But so we need investment, heavy investment in infrastructure, and if it takes a bit longer to roll in, well, then that's a 3-4 year program, which will be very necessary if the recovery, as I believe it, the natural recovery, is going to be quite slow, and then this is going to fill the gap until the economy can be taken fully off its life support system and give us new assets as well.
If you were asked to say something nice about the Chicago School of Economics, what would it be?
I think the greatest member of the Chicago School of Economics in the post-war period by far was Milton Friedman. And I think his followers, by carrying some of his insights to an absurd conclusion. They were rather like people who, starting from absurd premises, end in madness by a system of relentless logic. We know those people. I mean, we meet them the whole time. We call them cranks in ordinary walks of life. They have very, very good logical processes, but their initial assumptions are loony. And then they argue, often very well, from those assumptions to some conclusion. Now, I'm afraid even Nobel Prize winners do suffer from this tendency. Now, Milton Friedman made one very, very important point, and it was a necessary modification for the Keynesian system. He always, by the way, thought of himself as, in some sense, a Keynesian, Milton Friedman. And that was the idea of the natural rate of unemployment. And he said that really, by full employment or feasible employment that the government could sort of shouldn't go beyond, it had to be feasible full employment was the natural rate. Beyond that, if you tried to reduce unemployment below the natural rate, we don't quite know what the natural rate was, but it depended on characteristics of the labor market and other things. If you tried to reduce unemployment below that, you ran into inflationary problems, and then you had to try and suppress the inflation by wages and prices policy, incomes policy, and that was the trap into which I think Keynesian policy fell in the late 60s and early 70s. And when Nixon said we're all Keynesians now in 1971, it was accompanied by a great big wages and prices freeze. Now, you avoid all that if you take seriously the natural rate of unemployment, and I think that was Friedman's enormous contribution, and I think he deserved a Nobel Prize for it. But that's the good thing, I'd say, about Chicago economics.